Yesterday's news, I think, brought a shift in the national response that we're seeing to this crisis. The president yesterday outlined some more drastic measures about how the country can respond to it, including, really limiting unnecessary travel, cutting back on how many people get together in a space, really dwelling down on closing schools and things like that. So when policymakers are thinking about these kinds of official recommendations, how do they know what to do? What kind of predictions can they make? Because as much confidence as we want to have in these kinds of recommendations, unfortunately, there's no way to know the future for sure. And so the next best thing is to do some mathematical modeling. So I wanted to talk you through the overall principles behind some of the mathematical models that scientists are working on right now to help predict what might happen. And these kinds of mathematical models give us kind of the range of possibilities to help policymakers make these decisions. So one of the simplest models for how to predict the course of an epidemic is to think about categorizing everybody in a population into, again, in the simplest form, 3 different categories. People can be susceptible. So for instance, with the COVID-19 virus, none of us have ever been exposed to it before, so we're all susceptible. Once you get infected, then you move into a category of being in the infectious phase. Now you have the virus, and there's a certain possibility of you passing that virus on to somebody else. Those who then either recover, become immune to the virus, or die are then categorized in the removed category. So this is called an SIR model in infectious disease modeling. And so, again, everybody starts out in the susceptible category, and you can move to the infectious category at a certain probability that we'll call A. Now, once you're infected, then you have a certain probability of either recovering or being otherwise removed from that population, and we'll call that probability of B. Now, the simple way of tying these different categories together is to say that from one day to the next, the change in the number of people who are in this infectious category can be calculated by thinking about how many times they're interacting with people in the susceptible category. So that would be multiplying I times S, and then factoring in the probability that those susceptible people then get infected. So that would be multiply that by that probability A. So that's the new people who are getting infected. Now, at the same time, you're also subtracting the people who are recovering. So then you would subtract that probability of recovering, B, times the number of people who are infected. So this essentially helps you determine the change in the number of infected people from day to day. And when you model that along time, you end up with a curve where you start with just a few infected people. That starts to go up very quickly as they infect more people, and then it starts to come down as more people start to recover. And so we've seen this curve a lot. And the shape of that curve depends a lot on the disease dynamics as well. How infectious is the disease? How likely is it for someone who's in the susceptible category to get infected? How quickly does somebody recover? How quickly do they move from the I to the R? Is there a vaccine that could potentially help take people in the S category and have them jump all the way over to the R category because they can't get infected anymore? So this is a very simple model of how you might think about disease dynamics. Now, this is particularly simple because we're thinking about everybody in the population as having the same characteristics. But in fact, we know that we're not all the same. With the COVID-19 virus, we're seeing that young people have a higher probability of recovery than older people. We know that not everybody lives in the same geographic area with the same likelihood of passing it on between their social networks. And so scientists have now developed much more complicated models that allow them to factor in all of these different variables to create a more accurate representation of the population. And so one thing that hit the news last night was a new paper that was published by a team at Imperial College in the UK that showed this type of complex prediction model for both the US and the UK. And what they did was ran some of these simulations to show what might happen under different disease characteristics, under different interventions of social distancing and some of the other approaches that we're talking about right now, to think about what would happen to the shape of this curve. And I think what really shocked everybody who's been talking about this report is that in their worst case scenario, under which the US would just go about business as usual, their model shows up to 2.2 million people dying in the US. And that's a really scary number. So that kind of prediction is what drives policymakers to really encourage the types of behavioral changes that we're doing now, because we don't have a drug yet, we don't have a vaccine yet to help people make this jump from S to R. So we really need to keep this I number low so that we don't overwhelm our hospitals. Now, the other thing about models, of course, is that on one hand, while it's easy to play around with these numbers and see how the computer projections change, the accuracy of the prediction is only as accurate as the assumptions that we build into the model. So for instance, right now, because we don't have very good testing data in the US about how many people are getting infected and how many people are getting sick, we don't know very good estimates of some of these parameters that will help us make the model more accurate. So the more data that comes in, the more that epidemiologists can refine some of their models and make these predictions more accurate. But this is the game that we're playing, is that it's trying to get our best possible prediction of the unknown and take action now without 100% certainty of whether that will play out in the future. So I hope that today we've given you a little bit of insight into some of the mathematics that goes into predicting the future of an epidemic like we're seeing today, and how that kind of scientific modeling can help real-world policymakers. Thanks for joining us today. We'll be back again tomorrow talking about another aspect of the coronavirus pandemic. Thanks a lot.